a ship doctor on a voyage to Antarctica, and all the way to Antarctica for a month, looking after 60 people on board, keeping them all alive and well, 5 days sailing away from any other medical care. My first thought was, absolutely not. That's terrifying, far too scary. I'm very lucky. I've done a few expeditions already as a doctor. I really, really enjoy it. But all of those have been land-based and not nearly as remote as Antarctica. So it was a little bit different, and as you can imagine, a little bit scary. But I'm going to share my screen now and show you something that I think will prove to you why I was convinced otherwise. So this is the Bark Europa. And the moment I saw her and this photograph, as you can imagine, I signed my name on the dotted line and began planning this adventure and begging my medical defense union to please insure me. The Bark Europa was built in 1911 in Hamburg, and she originally served as a lightship on the River Elbe before moving to the Netherlands in 1986 and being rebuilt into a bark, which is a square-rigged 3-mast sailing vessel. She's very, very special, as you'll come to hear, and she's known as the Ocean Wanderer and spends her year navigating the globe, circumnavigating the globe on various voyages, and she's the only sailing vessel to sail to Antarctica every single season. Now, back in January, if you can remember that far back, before the world became a very strange place, as Jo so wonderfully put in her Facebook advert, I donned my brave pants and found myself in Ushuaia at the tip of Argentina, a place that very much feels like the end of the world. And I was all set to start my adventure. Now, my first day on the Bark Europa wasn't quite what I'd expected it to be. I wasn't really sure what I expected, if I'm honest, but I guess I'd envisaged first day, setting sail, sun, wind in my hair, ocean out in front of us. And so I was a little bit surprised to roll up on day one with the rest of the crew and at about 9 in the morning be handed a mop and bucket and told to literally scrub the decks, for which I then did scrub the decks for about 3 days. That was completely fine. But the moment I was told about an hour into my cleaning duties that I did not know how to clean a cabin toilet properly or make a bunk bed or use the right color of cloth, it began to feel a little bit difficult. And I don't know about you guys, but I hate not being good at things. And I'm only mentioning this because this was my first lesson on this journey of the importance of humility in any new adventure. So I learned that on this journey, I was going to face lots of challenges that I wasn't going to know what I was doing all the time, and I wasn't always going to be good at everything. And learning that was going to really put me in good stead for the rest of the journey. So moving on, we did eventually set sail 3 days after starting our cleaning. And as we hit the Beagle Channel, our last bit of calm water, the crew decided to give us some sail training. So this meant we got our first chance to climb the mast, climb the rigging. Now, this was a bit of a strange experience as a doctor, as the ship doctor, because not only did I watch everyone else climb the rig and with my heart in my mouth and my mind frantically running through the inventory of the medical cupboard, but when it came to my turn to climbing it, I was climbing the rigging with the knowledge that if I were to fall, there wouldn't even be me to do any fixing. And so I have to admit that thought did freeze me in fear at times, and so much so at one point, I did in fact need to be rescued. As it turned out, there was someone else on board who could have done some fixing, but I will move on and tell you a little bit about that later. After the Beagle Channel came Drake's Passage. So this is a body of water that runs from Cape Horn on the southern tip of South America all the way to the South Shetland Islands, which lie outside of the Antarctic Peninsula. Any sailor in the audience will know that this is a notorious bit of water where the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean meet, and without any landmass getting in the way, there's no stopping that flow of water, which in real time means things can get a little bit hairy. As it happened, our passage was actually quite smooth, or so the crew kept telling me, but I have to admit I did succumb to some seasickness and unfortunately made a new friend on board. We spent a lot of time together. This was lesson number 2 in learning the importance of humility in any new adventure. Lesson being, the Drake does not discriminate, and it really does not care what qualifications you have. I have to admit there's nothing more humbling than throwing up into a bucket alongside a bunch of people who only 24 hours before you were explaining how they should cope with seasickness. So there we go. But eventually we found land, we saw land. And I have to say, no words can describe the feeling of seeing, smelling, and finally walking on land for the first time after 5 days on the Drake. Unfortunately, I didn't get too much time to relax and enjoy it, as with our first landing came our first medical incident, courtesy of this guy. This is Manny. He was our oldest guest on the ship, and I did ask his permission to tell you that and to tell his story this evening. And actually his story ties in quite nicely with my third lesson in humility in any new adventure, which is always accept any offer of help. So I want you to picture the scene. We've just landed. It's very, very rocky, very kind of lunar landscape on the South Shetland Islands. And I get a call to say that Manny's taken a fall. So I attend the scene. Unfortunately, much to John Muir's horror, there's blood everywhere. We're definitely leaving our trace. Manny's fallen, he's got blood coming from his head. And to my horror, I notice one of his fingers is sitting at a right angle, big juicy chunk of bone sticking out. And this is what in medical terms we would call a displaced open fracture, every expedition medic's worst nightmare. So being a doctor, I know that I have to straighten his finger. Otherwise his blood supply, nerve supply could be compromised. So I'm putting myself together, mentally preparing myself, getting my gloves on, getting my kit. When over my left shoulder, I see this woman swoop in, one of our voyage crew, one of the paying guests on the ship, who I happen to know is a German anaesthetist who works in war zones, swoops in and without a word, pulls, straightens Manny's finger and then walks off again. Now, many doctors might have been a bit put out by this, you know, a little bit annoyed that someone had taken their moment in the spotlight. But I was very grateful, and her assertiveness was very welcome in that moment. I have to say, all the cleaning, daily dressing, and worrying about Manny's wound was left down to me. But I'm very happy to report that Manny is alive and well and has a fully functioning finger today. So our journey continued down the Antarctic Peninsula, sailing down the coast through simply dreamlike landscapes. It's hard to describe, with iconic names such as Livingston Island, Gerlach Strait, the Lemaire Channel. A place soaked in history, a lot of British history, exploration, very inspiring history, but also obviously some devastating history too. Now at this point, I think I've probably got a minute and a half left to tell you about the rest of my trip, or probably less because of that little interlude. And it's really difficult, obviously, to describe, to do that. So what I thought I'd do is tell you something that my mum said to me, who I know is watching, before I went. She told me that Antarctica would change my life. Going there would change my life. And I really didn't know what she meant. But I know now that she was right. And I've been trying to think over the last few months about what makes it so special as a place and what made my trip so special. I wondered if it's the landscapes, the icebergs, the shapes and the colours are nothing like I could have ever imagined without seeing them. I wondered if it was the wildlife, getting up close and personal to penguins, seals, whales, all kinds of birds, in a way that felt very different, again, to anything I'd experienced before. You know, this landscape is their territory. You're very much visitors, and that feels very special. I wondered if it was the silence. Often in Antarctica, all you hear is the aching or moaning of ice, the cracking, carving of many glaciers that you see. Or maybe it was the freezing cold water on my skin the few times I went in, those few moments, blessed moments before hypothermia and delirium sets in. Or maybe it was the sunsets that I think speak for themselves. I actually think scrap all of that, and I think it was the Ukrainian distilled vodka that I was lucky enough to sample in Vernadsky Research Station. I definitely recommend that. It was obviously, of course, all those things, but for me, certainly on this trip, it was also about how I got there on a ship, Europa, that is at the same time powerful and competent on the sea, but is also small and delicate enough to get you to the very inaccessible and beautiful places of the White Continent. And it was absolutely about the people that I went with, people who accepted me for my skill, but also for my lack of skill often. People who baked me not 1, but 5 sponge cakes on my birthday that I spent in Antarctica. That's quite a memory. So you'll be happy to know that on arriving back in Ushuaia, we spent a further 3 days cleaning. But I have to say, and without being cheesy, this time cleaning a ship that had become my home for the month alongside people who genuinely felt like family was a whole different experience and not a chore at all. So thank you very much for listening, and sorry for the technical difficulties.
Super wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophie. Absolutely amazing.